A woman stands at her kitchen sink, washing a single teacup, the one he used every morning. The house is quiet now, not just quiet, but hollow, like the silence has its own weight. The same routines remain, but something fundamental is missing. Her heart beats faster, her breath comes shallow. She hasn't been sleeping well. Her body feels heavy in ways she can't explain. Food tastes different. Her memory slips. And though nothing is visibly wrong, no fever, no infection, no wound, she can feel herself fraying at the edges. She isn't ill, she's grieving. We've long understood grief as a spiritual or emotional experience, an ache in the soul, a wound in the heart. But what if that heartache is more than metaphor? What if grief doesn't just affect how we feel, but how we function? What exactly happens to the body when the heart breaks? This is where science begins to illuminate what poetry has always suggested. Grief is not just sorrow, it's biological. Underneath the pain of loss, research shows measurable, sometimes dramatic changes across nearly every system in the body. Stress hormones like cortisol surge, the immune system weakens, inflammation rises, brain chemistry shifts in regions responsible for memory, attention, even pain. The gut changes. Sleep fractures. Genes begin to express themselves differently. Grief leaves fingerprints, molecular, neurological, cellular. And here lies the contradiction. We often ask mourners to move on, to heal emotionally, to stay strong. But what if the body can't simply comply? What if grief is not a psychological failure, but a deeply intelligent, if devastating, biological event? One that rewires the body in response to profound loss? What if the ache in your chest is not imagined, but encoded in the body's deepest system? Grief, then, may not just reshape your worldview. It may reshape you, quietly, invisibly, cell by cell. Grief has always been with us, but how we respond to it has changed dramatically over time. In ancient cultures, grief was a communal and embodied experience. When someone died, the community gathered. There were rituals, wailing, mourning clothes, and shared ceremonies that stretched on for weeks or months. People were expected to show their grief, to collapse, to cry publicly, to fall apart without shame. Mourning wasn't hidden, it was honored. Loss was seen as a rupture not just in the individual, but in the fabric of the community itself. But by the 20th century, particularly in the West, grief was quietly pushed inward. Psychology became the dominant framework, and with it came models that attempted to organize grief into tidy emotional stages: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance. Useful in some ways, but overly simplistic. And in the process, something essential was overlooked: the body. For a long time, grief was thought of as psychological terrain, a matter of mood, of memory, of emotional resilience. But in the last 2 decades, scientists have begun to uncover something far more complex. Biologists and neuroscientists are now mapping what grief actually does to the body, and the findings are startling. Cortisol, the body's primary stress hormone, spikes and can stay elevated for weeks or months, damaging organs, disrupting sleep, and weakening the immune response. In grieving individuals, white blood cell activity often declines, making them more susceptible to illness. Brain scans show changes in the anterior cingulate cortex and amygdala, regions tied to emotion regulation and fear. Functional MRI studies reveal that early-stage grief activates the same neural circuits as physical pain. The brain, it turns out, does not distinguish sharply between a broken bone and a broken bond. These revelations arrive at a critical moment in history. In the aftermath of a global pandemic, the world is grieving on a scale not seen in generations. Millions have lost loved ones, many in isolation, without funerals, without rituals, without goodbyes. And yet this grief often remains unspoken. There's a quiet epidemic of loss happening in bedrooms, offices, and hospitals. Grief without recognition, without witness. What's more, complicated grief, where mourning becomes prolonged, overwhelming, and debilitating, is now being recognized as a clinical condition. Studies show it can mimic depression, reduce cognitive function, and persist for years. This has profound implications for mental health services, workplace accommodations, public health policy, and our collective understanding of what healing really requires. What's truly at stake is our perception. If we continue to treat grief as just sadness, We risk failing those whose bodies are breaking under its weight. We risk pathologizing what is, in many cases, a biologically expected response to deep loss. Grief, science now confirms, doesn't just change how we feel, it changes how we function, affecting heart health, immune strength, brain chemistry, digestion, and sleep. To ignore its biology is to ignore its full truth, and to ignore its truth is to leave people suffering in silence, believing they are broken when in fact they are simply human. Grief, it turns out, doesn't just weigh on the heart metaphorically, it can break it in measurable, physiological ways. One of the most striking discoveries in the last 2 decades is the phenomenon known as broken heart syndrome, or stress cardiomyopathy, in which the heart's left ventricle temporarily weakens following an intense emotional shock. Statistically, widowed individuals face a significantly elevated risk of death in the months following a partner's loss. It's not just despair, it's biology. Studies have shown that grieving people experience a rise in pro-inflammatory cytokines, molecular signals that, when overproduced, suppress the immune system, increase susceptibility to illness, and place strain on the cardiovascular system. These responses mirror those seen in people experiencing physical trauma or chronic stress. But what initiates this storm of physiological changes? The answer may lie deep in the grieving brain. One of the most unexpected findings in neuroscience is the behavior of the brain's default mode network in those experiencing prolonged grief. This system, which activates when we recall others, reflect on ourselves, or envision familiar people, does not shut off after death as you might expect. Instead, it remains persistently active. The brain continues to simulate the presence of the person who is gone, as if holding a neurological space for them to return. In this sense, the grieving mind doesn't simply remember, it rehearses. It keeps that lost person alive in its inner maps, sometimes months or even years after their passing. This mismatch between what the brain perceives and what the world insists is true creates a disorienting tension. Reality says they're gone. Your body is still waiting for them to walk through the door. This is where the dilemma becomes painfully clear. Medicine is designed to treat the body. Psychiatry is designed to treat the mind. But grief doesn't respect that boundary. It exists in both realms at once. It manifests through inflammation, insomnia, chest tightness, digestive trouble, but it also appears as brain fog, emotional numbness, haunting memories. So where do we place it? Is grief a mental illness if it lasts too long? Is it a biological injury, a form of emotional trauma, a sacred rite of passage, or all of the above? There is no consensus, and this lack of clarity has real-world consequences. People suffering the physical effects of grief, heart palpitations, chronic fatigue, immune dysfunction, are rarely recognized as grieving by their doctors. Instead, they may be labeled anxious, depressed, or simply stressed. Meanwhile, mental health support is often short-term, emotionally focused, and rarely connected to the somatic dimension. The health system is not built to hold grief in its full complexity, and so it often doesn't hold it at all. This disconnect between what science is beginning to understand and what society is prepared to address reveals a haunting irony. Grief, though one of the most universal human experiences, remains one of the least understood, and perhaps one of the least honored in its full biological depth. Throughout history, humans have mourned loudly. In Victorian England, mourning was not just permitted, it was structured, visible, and expected. People wore black for months or even years. Homes displayed crepe on their doors. Women withdrew from public life. There were rules about when to speak, how to act, and what music to play. These practices, while strict, acknowledge something essential, that grief changes you, and that this transformation needs time, space, and collective recognition. Today, in many parts of the Western world, that space has collapsed. Grief is often treated as a private emotional inconvenience. Bereavement leave lasts days, not months. Public rituals are rare. People are encouraged, implicitly or explicitly, to move on, to get back to work, to recover as if from a minor illness. But what if this rush to return to normal comes at a deep biological cost? Grief, as emerging science reveals, is not a soft emotion. It is a full-body response, one that suppresses immune function, alters sleep, weakens the heart, and floods the bloodstream with stress hormones. If we accept that grief can raise inflammation and disrupt core physiological systems, shouldn't we begin to treat it like we treat any other health condition? And if we now know that grief can alter gene expression, turning some genes on and others off, then we must ask an even harder question. Can grief be inherited? Could the loss one generation endures ripple into the biology of the next through epigenetic pathways? The science is early, but the possibility reframes loss, not just as an individual event, but as an intergenerational phenomenon.
At its core, this scientific unfolding returns us to a timeless question. What does the body do with love once it's gone? If love shapes the nervous system, if it bonds through hormones, rhythms, attachment circuitry, then what happens to that finely tuned biological structure when the person it was designed around disappears? The answer seems to be that the body remembers. It remembers in the heart, in the vagus nerve, in the altered rhythms of breath and digestion. The loss of love becomes a physiological state, not just a psychological one. The body must metabolize it, like a nutrient that's suddenly missing, or a substance the system can no longer use. And yet, this biological truth stands in sharp contrast to how grief is often handled in society. Western cultures tend to privatize and pathologize mourning. People are expected to contain their grief, to hold it in, to avoid making others uncomfortable. This isolation may intensify the biological effects of grief, leaving individuals to suffer without the communal buffers humans evolved with. In contrast, many cultures in Africa, the Middle East, and Asia incorporate grief into the fabric of community life. There are public ceremonies, communal meals, wailing rituals, prayers, dances. These aren't just cultural artifacts. They may be biologically adaptive. They allow the nervous system to process loss through movement, sound, rhythm, and collective regulation. They give the body what it needs to release, to integrate, to heal. Complicating this landscape is the widespread popularity of oversimplified models of grief, like the 5 stages: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance. While originally intended as a way to understand the grieving process in terminally ill patients, this model has been generalized and misapplied to all forms of grief. It suggests a neat progression, a psychological ladder to climb. But real grief is messier. It loops, spirals, recurs. It's non-linear. It's somatic. One moment you feel okay, the next you're collapsed by a song or a scent. The body stores grief like a hidden archive, and it doesn't follow a calendar. Scientific research is now beginning to catch up. Studies on the vagus nerve, a key pathway between brain, heart, and gut, suggest that grief disrupts our ability to regulate internal states. Heart rate variability drops. The limbic system, which controls emotional memory, lights up when reminded of the lost one. These aren't simply thoughts. They are full-body experiences of absence. They are the brain and body trying to integrate the impossible. And this leads to a deeper philosophical implication. If love leaves a signature in the body, does loss leave a scar? Is grief, in its most enduring form, a kind of embodied memory, a reshaping of the self around the shape of what was lost? These questions are not just academic. They reshape how we might care for the grieving, not with empty platitudes or brief condolences, but with a recognition that they are undergoing a transformation, one that touches biology as deeply as it touches the heart. Grief is not just remembering someone, it is becoming someone new in their absence. And that becoming, it turns out, lives in every cell. The most startling truth about grief is that it doesn't just echo through our emotions, it restructures us, not symbolically, but biologically. Grief is not a moment, nor merely a feeling. It's a reorganization of the body's systems in response to absence. When someone we love disappears from our world, the body doesn't simply feel sad. It behaves as though it's under threat. The immune system acts as if under attack. Inflammatory pathways light up. Hormones surge. Genes that once regulated calm now prepare for danger. But the danger isn't external. It's invisible. It's absence. and the body doesn't quite know what to do with that. Inside the grieving brain, entire neural maps collapse. There were networks devoted to that person, to their face, their voice, the rhythm of their footsteps, the way they said your name, and now those circuits have no task. They remain online, sometimes for months or years, awaiting input that will never come. In deep grief, some people report hearing their loved one's voice, seeing their silhouette in the crowd, reaching for a phone to call them before remembering. These aren't delusions. They're the brain running familiar simulations, trying to fill a space it has not yet let go of. Studies show that even motor behavior can change. Your walk, your sleep, your gestures, all may unconsciously adjust in the absence of someone who shaped your environment. Even more astonishing are the changes occurring at the cellular level. Researchers have found that in people experiencing intense grief, the activity of white blood cells shifts dramatically. The gene expression profile begins to resemble that of someone fighting a physical injury or infection. This isn't metaphor, it's molecular reality. The body interprets the loss as a kind of internal wounding, one that must be managed and contained. The grieving immune system doesn't malfunction. It reorganizes, it adapts. But in adapting, it often leaves the person more vulnerable, more fragile, more exhausted. Grief is not the system breaking, it's the system rebuilding without a critical piece. And here lies the deepest realization. Grief isn't weakness. It's not a lack of strength or resilience or willpower. It's not a pathology to be corrected. It's the body trying to protect itself from a threat it cannot name, the disappearance of meaning, of attachment, of continuity. Grief is the internal world being forced to reorient around a new external reality. And because everything we are is shaped in relationship to others, losing someone we love means the very scaffolding of self begins to shake. Grief, then, is not something to cure. It's something to carry. It is not a flaw to fix. It's a form of love that has lost its destination. And the body, aching and intelligent, rewires itself not to forget, but to survive. It begins again, not because it wants to, but because it must. This is what grief truly is. Love, adapting to silence. We now know, with striking clarity, that grief is not merely emotional anguish. It is a biological state that touches nearly every system in the body. It activates the stress response, flooding the bloodstream with cortisol and adrenaline. It disrupts sleep cycle, alters digestion, and depresses immune function. In some, chronic grief can even mimic symptoms of depression, PTSD, and autoimmune disorders. But it is distinct. Grief is not a dysfunction, it is a response, a profound one. And recognizing this difference is critical. It means that the goal of care is not to suppress or pathologize grief, but to support the body and mind through it. Understanding the biology of grief helps clinicians differentiate between healing and harm, between normal adaptation and true medical crisis. It shifts our approach from silencing the symptoms to listening to what they're saying. This recognition has led to a quiet revolution in how grief is treated. Traditional talk therapy, while still valuable, is no longer the only path. Body-based approaches, like somatic experiencing, which helps people process trauma through bodily sensation rather than words. EMDR, eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, which helps rewire traumatic memory pathways. And polyvagal informed treatments that work directly with the autonomic nervous system are being integrated into grief work. These therapies recognize that grief lives in the body as much as the mind, and the body, with the right tools, can learn to breathe again, to rest again, to feel safe in a world forever changed. What's most hopeful, perhaps, is the evidence for neuroplasticity, the brain's innate ability to change and adapt. Even after devastating loss, new neural connections can form. Memory doesn't disappear, but it integrates. Love doesn't vanish, it reshapes. The grieving brain doesn't forget the one who is gone. Rather, it slowly rewires itself around their absence. This is not erasure, it's evolution. In time, new patterns of meaning, presence, and connection begin to emerge. Grief, then, is not a wall, it's a passage. This scientific awakening is beginning to ripple outward into social and cultural spaces. Movements for grief literacy are gaining momentum, aiming to educate not just mental health professionals, but workplaces, schools, and communities. They argue that grief is not rare, it's universal, and so it must be supported not only in clinics, but in daily life. Policies are shifting too. Some employers are expanding bereavement leave. Some schools are training staff in grief sensitivity. Compassion-based neuroscience is helping to shape these efforts, reframing grief not as dysfunction, but as a deeply human biological process deserving care, time, and dignity. The core insight emerging from all of this is both simple and profound. Grief is not something to get over. It is not a task to complete or a weakness to hide. It is something to move with, like weather, like waves, like breath. When honored rather than rushed, grief becomes a pathway, not to forgetting, but to integration. It opens space for what researchers now call post-traumatic growth, the ability of the body and mind to rebuild not in spite of loss, but because of what the loss has carved open. In this way, grief reshapes not only the biology of the one who mourns, but the culture that learns to bear witness. A young boy sits cross-legged beside his grandfather's grave, the afternoon sun casting long shadows across the grass. He clutches a drawing, crayon lines, stick figures, a smiley sun in the corner. It's simple, but full, a quiet gift for someone who can no longer receive it. Beside him, his father kneels and gently places a hand on the boy's shoulder. They don't speak, but in the silence, something ancient moves between them. Not just sadness, not even memory, something deeper, something shared, an echo of presence. The moment passes without words, but their bodies remember. The rhythm of love, the weight of absence, the warmth of what once was. It's not just the heart that grieves, it's the whole body, because love was never just emotional, it was physiological. The nervous system learned someone's voice, someone's scent, the way their laugh softened tension in the room. When that person disappears, the body doesn't forget, it aches, not because it's broken, but because it once knew something real. This is the quiet biology of grief. It doesn't announce itself with clarity or certainty. It whispers through chest tightness, through restless nights, through tears that seem to rise from nowhere. It's a language the body speaks when it's trying to hold what it no longer can. And that language is not weakness. It's not dysfunction. It's love, translated into chemistry and flesh. Grief is the price we pay for love that truly mattered. And far from being a failure of the body, grief may be its most eloquent proof that we lived well, that we were once deeply connected, that something real was shared, and that connection left a mark, not just on the mind, but on the cells. So perhaps the real question is this. If the body mourns those we've lost, if it aches, remembers, adapts, could it be that love leaves behind more than memory? Could it leave behind a shape, a rhythm, a biological signature woven into who we are, not just in thoughts or dreams, but in breath, in heartbeat, in the way we now hold someone else's hand a little tighter? Grief, then, is not just the shadow of absence. It's the lingering presence of something once whole, a signal that what we lost was never just outside us, it was inside us too, and maybe, in some quiet, cellular way, it still is.